Good evening, and welcome back. I want to start by saying I almost didn't record tonight. Not for any dramatic reason, just tired. The kind of tired that makes you stare at your notes for a while and wonder if the notes are tired too. But here we are. You're here, which means I should be here, and the story I have for you tonight is one that I genuinely did not want to hand off to some other evening, because it deserves to be said in one piece, or at least I want to try. Tonight, we're going somewhere old, older than most of the stories I tell you, older than the names we have for the people in it. We are going to a place that might have been real, a city that breathed, that kept records, that had running water, and people who argued about property lines and the price of grain and all the ordinary things that make a civilization rather than a myth. Or it was a lesson, a philosopher's lesson, dressed so carefully in the clothing of history, stone walls, named kings, measurements given down to the foot, that 2,000 years later, it still sits in the mouth like memory rather than invention. We are going to Atlantis, and I don't say that word lightly. I'm aware of everything that word drags in behind it. The cranks and the treasure hunters and the cable television specials. I know, but the original story, where it comes from, what it was actually trying to do, the strange fact that it has survived this long without any evidence and without any proof and without the ocean giving a single thing back, that is worth sitting with seriously. So that is what we are doing. We will start at the beginning, which is, as these things usually are, a god who made a decision. There is an ocean that runs past the edge of the known world, past the boundary the old sailors planted and called final. The wind out there has a particular quality, I'm told. Not told personally, obviously, but the texts carry it. A smell of distance, of open water and long crossing, a light in the morning that makes smallness feel acceptable. And in that ocean, somewhere in the middle of it, there is an island. This is not a continent, not something a nation plants its flag in and argues over for centuries. An island, the kind a person could learn by heart. Low hills, forests that go dark early before the rest of the sky, red soil, coasts that catch the last light and hold it. On that island there is a hill, not the tallest thing in the world, but tall enough to matter, tall enough to see a long distance from the top of it. And at the foot of the hill, this is the part I find hard to describe cleanly, and I'm not entirely sure why. At the foot of the hill, there is a young woman. Her name is Plato. Her parents are dead. She lives in the house her father left her, and she keeps it quietly. And she has the hill and the water view and the habits of someone who has learned to be self-sufficient, the way you only really learn it when there's no alternative. Poseidon finds her. The god of the sea moves through the world in the way that the very powerful and the very restless both move through it, covering distance without particularly meaning to. He finds the island on one of those wanderings, and he finds her on the hill, and something in him stops the way. No, something settles. The way deep water settles before it does something that will change the geography permanently. He decides on her. He decides on the hill. And because he is a god, and because gods in these stories do not love by half measures or polite gestures, he makes the hill into something remarkable. He draws rings, 3 rings of water, 2 rings of land between them, concentrically arranged, centered on the hill and the woman he has decided to love. From above, And this is the detail I keep coming back to for reasons I cannot entirely defend. It would look like the pattern a stone makes when dropped into still water. Those perfect circles moving outward, except frozen, pressed flat, made permanent. The god digs down and fills the channels with seawater, warm and living. And the island inside the rings becomes a place only he decides who enters. He builds a life there with her. The grove he plants has shade that always falls correctly. There are 2 springs from the bedrock. One runs warm, steam in the morning, relief at night. The other runs cold, cold enough that people who drink from it in later years will cite it sincerely as one of the better arguments for staying. Those 2 springs matter later, practically speaking. But right now, they are just a god doing what gods do when they are trying to say something they don't have other words for. They have children, 10 sons in 5 pairs, each one born on the ringed hill with the sound of the 2 springs in the background. The eldest is Atlas. I'll be honest, I linger on Atlas more than I probably should, relative to how much page time the original text gives him. There's something about the description, even second-hand, even translated, that makes him feel present. The gravity of him, the voice that carries without effort, the sense that people around him modulated their behavior without being asked to. I don't know. Some historical figures do that, some mythological ones too. Poseidon gives Atlas everything, the whole island, the title. And then, and this is the move that I think explains something about how myth functions, how it anchors itself to the physical world so that you cannot quite shake it loose. The god gives the boy the ocean itself, names it for him. And so the water that wraps every coast of every continent, the water the sailors navigate by star and current, and argument and memory, that water carries the name of a boy born on a ringed hill in the middle of it. The Atlantic, named for an island that may be gone. Let me collect the thread here. I want to make sure I haven't lost you in the geography of this. The other 9 sons receive land, portions, title, and the obligation that comes with title. They are princes in the old sense, governors, really, of what they are given, and they understand, whether by instruction or by the weave of how the family was built, that they answer to the eldest. Not because Atlas demands it, because the order was put in before anyone was old enough to object. Now, the land. Certain places in the world seem to arrive at an agreement with themselves that everything should grow. Atlantis is one of those places. The soil is dark near the rivers and lighter and workable in the drier high ground, and both kinds do their work. Grain, vines that thicken until they look like they mean to stay indefinitely. Olive trees with the particular patience that olive trees seem to carry regardless of where they grow, and the oil they produce burns steadily, slowly, keeps lamps alive through long winters. Orchards, timber in the hills, stone in the quarries, white stone that takes a polish, red stone that keeps its color in salt air, and metal, deeper in the mountain, copper, and further in, something else, something the people of the island value the way you value a thing that works perfectly and also happens to be beautiful. It holds its color in sea air. It doesn't corrode. In sunlight, it glows. This is the description that survives. Like a coal in the moment, just before it goes dark. There is a modern sensibility that wants to. But no, we'll stay in the story. People argue later about what it was. whether it was a metal in its own right or something made by hands that had learned a process nobody else had yet. On the island, in the time we're talking about, nobody argues. They have it. They call it orichalcum. They weigh it with the same care they give gold. Anyway, that is what the island was made of. That is the inheritance the sons received. A ringed hill, an ocean named for the eldest, soil that cooperated, stone in 2 colors, a metal that didn't know how to disappoint. What they built from it. That's where the story gets both extraordinary and, I'll admit this now, because the hour is late and I am tired enough to be honest, complicated. Not complicated like a puzzle. Complicated like something that was once very large and is now known only in pieces that don't all face the same direction. So there, the building they did was meticulous. The texts describe it in the way a building inspector describes a building. Measurements, materials, which surface was covered, in which metal, which temple faced which direction. It's almost excessive. The kind of detail that either means someone was there and remembered carefully, or someone wanted very badly for you to believe someone was there and remembered carefully. I cannot tell you which. I kept the detail because the specificity of it does something to the listener. It makes you see walls. But what I want you to hold on to right now, as we go further into this, as the city grows more elaborate and the kings grow more numerous, and the pride that was always waiting in the family begins to surface, is the image of that first hill, the girl who kept her father's house, the god who drew rings in the earth because he didn't know how else to say stay, before the capital city, before the armies and the harbors and the metal-plated walls, before the war that this story is secretly, slowly building toward. It was just a hill and 2 springs, one warm, one cold, and a man who loved them enough to make the ocean answer to the name of his son. Atlas and his brothers do not rush. That is the thing. That is the thing I keep coming back to when I try to explain why the early part of this story feels different from every other story about people who've been handed enormous power. They have an island that produces everything. They have a god for a father and an inheritance already decided. And they do not. They build towards something quieter than grandeur. They build toward function, toward the kind of excellence that does not need to be witnessed to exist. They raise shrines before they raise walls. The sacred ground near the springs and the hill gets no gold at first. What it gets is the best of what the people actually have. A carved beam, a bowl made from deep blue stone that holds light in it the way a cupped hand holds water. A ring of orichalcum made by a smith who is, and I find this detail worth keeping. I'm not entirely sure why. It just stayed with me. Still a little astonished that he can do what he can do. The people on the outer farms say the bread tastes different, that the wine from jars filled with water near the hill lasts longer. Small miracles, the kind that arrive on a Tuesday and do not require a ceremony to be felt. And that is exactly the kind of miracle that builds something lasting in people. The slow kind, the kind even a skeptical man can accept without feeling he has surrendered something. Atlas comes into his kingship the way. He comes into it gradually, carefully. He is present, and then more present. And the room is warm before you noticed it changing. His first acts are habits installed as law. He gathers his brothers at the central hill and says plainly what they already know, because saying a thing in the right place makes it binding in a way that knowing it privately does not. Each governs what he was given. Each sends tribute. They meet to judge each other. To judge, not to agree, which is a distinction that keeps families from rotting from the inside. They bring disputes to the temple and leave with their duties clarified and their pride reduced to something workable. The engineering starts with water. The rings Poseidon drew out of love become, under human hands, infrastructure. Atlas has bridges laid across the water channels, wide enough for a cart, so that the island's produce can move inward without waiting for boats. He has a canal cut from the outermost ring to the open sea, wide enough for a ship with a tall prow to come in on the tide and find calm water waiting. Work crews keep the channel deep. They understand mud the way farmers understand soil, can read its color and consistency, and tell you whether the canal is healthy or beginning to fail. Drawbridges on the inner rings, raised fast in trouble, down in peace, so the city can breathe. So there, the harbor. I need to stop rushing past the harbor because I find it genuinely fascinating, and I've been moving too quickly. Sailors are not an impressionable group. They have seen too many ports that promise shelter and produced inconvenience. The harbor of Atlantis impresses them, and that sentence carries more weight than it looks like it does. Ships come in without fighting currents. The inner rings absorb the swells. There are landing stages cut into the stone at intervals that make practical sense, and workers who know their work and do it without being managed into it, which the texts note with the mild surprise of someone who has encountered this rarely enough to find it worth mentioning. I need to pause here. The stone. I want to make sure I describe the stone correctly, because it's one of those details where getting it slightly wrong loses the whole picture. 3 kinds of quarry, 3 colors. White stone for the walls that catch the most sun. The walls seen first. Red stone in bands along the arches, warm against the white. A reminder that the hill at the center of all of this is red at its core. Black stone at the foundations and the waterline, where the sea comes to test the building's resolve. And the ring walls are faced in metal, bronze on the outermost, which holds a polish, tin on the middle ring, which in certain lights looks like captured sky somehow. And the innermost wall is orichalcum, which at sunset looks like. This is where my notes say, looks like the horizon has been moved inside and ignited. And I wrote that down from the source material. And I have left it because I cannot improve it, and attempting to would be embarrassing. The temple inside the innermost ring, large enough to make a man feel small. The columns are sheathed in metal. The roof timbers are cedar that was seasoned for years before anyone touched it, because a beam raised too soon will move, will crack, and then the building spends its whole life compensating for that early impatience. The floor is white stone with blue veining, the way very old ice looks. In the interior, where the oil burns with a steadiness the priests maintain as a form of discipline, there is a statue, Poseidon in his chariot, the horses mid-step, the sea around the wheels appearing, and I don't know how else to say this, to move. The craftsman who made it had the kind of skill that does something to the eye without announcing what it's doing. The god is driving somewhere with the focus of a being who has a destination and intends to reach it. Around the base, a frieze in red metal, the 10 brothers receiving their portions. Plato with one hand raised in a gesture that reads as a welcome or blessing. And I think the ambiguity was deliberate. I think they wanted it to mean both. I think they knew what they were doing. The gold leaf on the walls. When the torches burn, the walls look like they are holding fire, not reflecting it. Anyway, the pillar, orichalcum. Atlas puts it in the precinct and has the laws carved into it. The letters angled to catch the light. Readable, present. The pillar is meant to carry something specific. The island's understanding that a place governed by rules that apply to everyone, including the 10 kings who made the rules, is stronger than any arrangement that depends on who happens to be in charge right now. Characters shift. Metal shifts less. The ceremony. Every 5th year and every 6th year. And I find the alternating schedule interesting in a way I can't fully justify. There's something in the asymmetry of it that feels deliberate. The 10 kings come to the precinct in crowns made from branches of the sacred grove, perishable things. Leaves made from what is growing nearby, which is the point of it, I think. They don't arrive in gold. They hunt a bull in the court, a real one, an animal that still has opinions about being caught, that can still break a man's leg if things go wrong. The skill required is actual skill. The nerves required are actual nerves. There is something. A modern person might want to say something here about the ethics of it, might feel the pull of that objection forming, and then the distance of 2,500 years presses back, and you let it go. You stay in the story. They swear over the blood, that they will rule with justice, that they will hold the law, that they will judge one of their own if that one drifts. The warm spring sends up steam, the cold one runs over its stone lip. The smell is warm blood and cedar smoke and salt air. A man standing there would have to work to forget what he just said. The work of forgetting comes later. That's the part we haven't reached yet. But it comes. It always does in stories like this one. And Atlantis is not different from other stories in that regard, only in the particulars of how long the forgetting takes and how thoroughly it is eventually answered. For now, the springs run, the laws hold, the harbor fills with ships, the city breathes, the plain beyond the rings. This is the part that gets less attention than it deserves, and I am guilty of that too. I spent so long on the temple and the orichalcum wall and the horses in the frieze that I nearly rushed past the thing that actually kept everyone alive, the plain, the farmland. The part of Atlantis that was not beautiful in the way a temple is beautiful, but was beautiful in the way a well-balanced tool is beautiful, which is the way that actually matters when you are trying to feed a city. Atlas has the engineers map it. Long rectangular plots aligned for irrigation. Channels cut at intervals, running downhill by gravity so that the farmer does not have to argue with the landscape to water his crops. Earthworks along the river margins to hold the flood in the wet months and slow the drain in the dry. These features do not appear in any description of the city that gets read aloud at ceremonies. They are in the background of everything. The forests are cut by rule. No timber taken without twice as many saplings planted. This is policy. After a generation, the policy pays for itself in continued timber, and the people who enforced it look far-sighted rather than merely stubborn, which is probably the best a practical law can hope for. The mines run copper, tin, the black stone with a good edge. Orichalcum goes first to the temple and the pillar. Then, once the ritual users are satisfied, it bleeds into daily life, the way any durable, beautiful material eventually does. Through usefulness, through the smith's apprentice who learns to fold it without cracking and becomes the person the whole street brings its metal problems to. A ring, a buckle, the nail at a ship's prow. This is how a material enters a culture. Quietly, through the side door, the schools, higher ground for the breeze, boys and girls both, numbers, letters, the plan of the rings drawn on wax tablets until the hand knows the shape before the mind consciously decides to make it, the names of the winds, how to read a harbor entrance by the color of the water over the bar and the set of the current. The sons of shipwrights learn to identify hull timbers by the sound they make when tapped. The daughters of merchants learn to find a false weight before the merchant who placed it has finished composing his face into innocence. I find myself wanting to linger on the curriculum. I am not sure why. It is not the most dramatic detail in the account, but something about the specificity of it, the harbor reading, the false weights, the sense that the city was trying to produce people who could not be easily fooled, keeps pulling at me. I'll move on. The priests teach the old hymns. The mariners teach dead reckoning. The texts treat both as the same kind of knowledge, which is the knowledge of trusting what has been accumulated over what feels immediately right. And I think that equation is doing a lot of quiet work in how Atlantis understood itself in these early years. So there, the festivals are when the city remembers what it is. On the day of the springs, people carry bowls of warm water and cold water and pour them together on the temple steps, and the steam that rises is brief and genuine, and the people say it means something about holding two qualities at once rather than choosing between them. I kept this detail. I'm not sure it needs explaining. On the day of ships, the harbour mouth wears garlands, and the old rowers take the benches one more time, while children beat time on whatever flat surface is nearby. On the day of laws, the pillar is washed until the letters stand clear, and the kings read the oldest passages aloud, with witnesses, because words read publicly attach themselves to the person reading them in ways that private reading cannot. The military, it is present, it does its job. The broad outer water ring is a practice course for horses and chariots. Companies drill formations on the plain. The harbour sheds keep hulls in conditions that preserve them. Stone walls and roof angles controlling the humidity, and the masters keep lists, oars, rigging, which crews are short, which hulls are taking water at the seams. A city that knows those things on any given morning can respond before the problem has fully declared itself. I need to pause here because I want to make sure I say the next part correctly. I've been through these notes several times, and I keep feeling like the obvious reading of this section misses something. This is the early Atlantis. This is the city before the Pride arrived. And what I find genuinely difficult to describe, and I mean this, I've tried several approaches to it in drafts and none of them are right, is the quality of daily life inside something that is functioning the way it was designed to function. It is mostly an absence. The absence of the friction that people who have lived inside badly ordered places know as the background condition of every day, The bridge holds. The water is clean. The law has the same weight regardless of who is standing under it. You live inside that long enough, and you begin to mistake it for the natural condition of human settlement. You begin to think order is the default. And that thought, that comfortable, reasonable sounding thought, is what precedes the forgetting of what the order costs to build and what it costs every single day to maintain. But that is later. Under Atlas and his brothers in those first years, the island knows what it is doing. The engineers are respected. The priests remember they serve something larger than the institution of priesthood. The farmers are honored at the same ceremony as the craftsmen, because a city that intends to keep eating must say out loud that it values the people who prevent it from going hungry. Wealth moves where it is needed. The temple shines. It does not try to outshine the sky. The island grows. Anyway, a city can be read in its mornings, and Atlantis in the morning belongs first to the harbor. Before the sun clears the outer wall, boys with brushes and baskets are already moving the keys, and a scribe sits at his booth with a fresh tablet, taking the name of every ship, every captain, every cargo, in columns so regular they look, from a distance, like a woven pattern on cloth. Dock masters stand at the pier heads with pointing staves and whistles. They place each hull where it will not block the next, and they count barrels as they're unloaded with the automatic focus of someone for whom counting has long since stopped requiring concentration. Then the markets, fish on tables, slope toward drains, and the smell is clean, the actual smell of the sea, because the island's fishermen understand that speed is the first ingredient in any dish that comes from the water. Bakers split the dark crust of the first loaves, and the steam is the warmest thing about a winter morning. Bread from wheat when the harvest is generous, from barley when it isn't. Olives, hard, salty cheese from goats that spent their lives on the herb-covered slopes above the city. Vinegar in small bowls on the counters. Children running through the colonnades until someone's finger snaps in their direction, at which point they find somewhere else to run. I don't know why I like that detail. I kept it. The smiths make their own kind of morning. Charcoal catches with a dry sound and finds its full voice when the bellows push air through it, and then the hammers start. Each forges a rhythm carrying down the lane until the sound of one bleeds into the sound of the next in a way that is. It is like a conversation between people who are each finishing a different sentence, which is a terrible comparison, and I know it, but I am leaving it in because the hour is late and the right one isn't coming. 2 jars near each anvil, water in one for the quick hard temper, oil in the other for a slower, gentler cooling. The small orichalcum work, clasps, belt fittings, the inlay line on a cup's rim, is made with a care that makes it look easier than it is. That is the signature of craft done well enough that the effort goes invisible into the result. The canal carries grain from the plain and timber from the mountain. It does this without drama, the way a body moves blood, continuously, quietly, noticed only when something goes wrong. Bargemen test depth with poles. They rake weeds from the bends. In dry months, the lockkeepers bleed water from the upper levels into the lower to keep the flow. The canal wardens are proud, specifically proud, the pride of people who maintain the thing everyone depends on and almost no one thinks about. That pride, that specific, functional, unshowy pride. That is what the early city runs on. The courts sit in colonnaded halls on the inner ring. Shade. The heat of argument, made bearable by shade. A citizen with a grievance walks in and tells it to a clerk, who records the names and the nature of the complaint in the same careful columns that appear in every record this city produces. The judges are chosen by the kings, but they answer to the pillar. There is a real difference there, and the city knows it. A judge who answers to the pillar answers to the law as it was written and agreed to, which is a different thing from answering to the preferences of whoever appointed you, and the distinction is what makes the whole arrangement worth having. Fines, public work, repeat offence brings harder answer. Exile is the severest thing the island offers, and exile is feared more than physical punishment. I find that worth sitting with. It tells you what the island means to the people living on it. To be sent beyond the rings is to lose the rhythm that makes the place alive, and the fear of that loss keeps the peace on most ordinary days, without anyone having to be visibly coercive about it. The warehouses along the outer ring hold tribute from the island's provinces: grain, oil in sealed jars, metal ingots in rows. The coins are plain, the god's face on one side, the pillar's sign on the other. No decoration. The value is in the exchange, not the object. In the evenings, the city winds down with the same care it used to wake. Gatekeepers close the inner bridge gates. Watchmen light the parapet lamps. Scribes stack and cover their tablets with linen. Children ask one more question before sleep. In the precinct, a single lamp burns before the god, because the precinct does not go fully dark. And that small continuity, I'm not sure why I keep returning to it in my notes. It is a minor detail, but it is the kind of minor detail that feels load-bearing somehow. That lamp is part of how the city understands itself to be a continuous thing, rather than a series of separate days. The air in the evening carries bathhouse smoke and salt, and olive oil burning in 100 lamps, the smell of a day that went the way it was supposed to go. That is the early Atlantis. That is what the springs and the rings and the law on the pillar made possible. Then, decline arrives the way a tide turns. You can be watching and still miss the exact moment. This is the truest thing the account says about what happened, and I want to say it plainly before I start describing the symptoms, because the symptoms are easy to catalogue, and the actual mechanism is harder to hold in your hands. A generation grew up that had never been cold in winter because the provision system existed and worked. Never hungry because the granaries held. Never confused about expectation because the law was clear and the judges applied it evenly. This generation did not choose softness. It swam in the comfort its parents built and understood the comfort to be the ocean, permanent, natural, not a constructed arrangement requiring daily maintenance. I want to be careful here about not turning this into a lecture about gratitude or work ethic, because I don't think that's what the account is actually saying. The account is saying something more structurally honest, which is that the knowledge of how hard a thing was to build does not automatically transfer to the people who inherit it, and the gap between those two kinds of knowing is where most civilizations eventually find their trouble. The change is atmospheric. That is the word I keep coming back to. A slight loosening of attention, a small substitution of the impression of a thing for the thing itself. A tendency to want credit before completion. The walls of the rings begin to be polished for a different reason. They were polished before because maintained metal resists corrosion, and because a wall polished regularly is a wall that will still be standing next season. Now they are polished because the shine impresses visitors, and because a city that impresses visitors feels from inside like a city that is doing well. That feeling has truth in it. There is also a trap in it. The trap being that you can start maintaining the impression while the reality it was meant to reflect quietly softens beneath the surface. And the impression, being more visible than the reality, is what gets maintained. Let me collect the thread here, because we're at the part of the story where several things start happening at the same time, and I want to make sure I give them in the right order. The banquets run later. The old custom was to eat well after the day's work and dismiss the musicians before midnight, so that the palace woke remembering it was a place of governance. Midnight becomes flexible. Musicians learn songs that praise the king's wisdom specifically by name, which is a different kind of song from one that praises wisdom as a general virtue, because the general virtue earns its praise through demonstration, whereas the named man earns his through the physical proximity of the compliment to his ear, and the two mechanisms produce different things in the man being praised over time. The dishes at these banquets arrive from further. Fish from waters the island's own fishermen cannot reach. Birds that would take a local hunter 10 days to find. Spices pronounced badly by everyone at the table, but present on the table because their presence announces connections that extend past the horizon. Men who inherited their positions, rather than building them through the discipline of the early years, begin to regard restraint as a philosophy suited to people with fewer options. The priests notice. They speak among themselves. They do not speak loudly to the public, because a priest who has been at this long enough understands that a sermon aimed at people not yet ready to receive it is experienced as noise. They wait, they keep the lamp burning. Anyway, the bull hunt. This is the detail that I find most, I want to say, heartbreaking. And I am going to resist that word because it implies a kind of emotional availability the account does not have. But I will say that this is the detail that stays with me longest after I put the notes down. The kings still come to the precinct in branch crowns. They still swear over the blood. But the bull, more often now, has been kept in a field. It is a fine animal. It is not a broken animal, but it is an animal that has encountered a boundary and learned to live within it. And there is a difference, a real, physical, felt difference between the courage required to bring down something that has always been free and the competence required to manage something that has been managed before. Old men who attended the earlier ceremonies, who still carry in their bodies the memory of real sweat and real danger and a genuine outcome not guaranteed in advance, notice the change the way people notice departures from things they knew firsthand, with complete certainty and almost no ability to explain that certainty to anyone who wasn't present. A symbol that is earned sits differently in the chest from one that has been arranged. The priests know the difference. They can feel it the way you feel the difference between a room where people are genuinely glad to see each other and a room where people are performing gladness, which is a comparison I recognize is imperfect too domestic for what I'm trying to describe, but I am leaving it because the hour is late and I have been at this a long time, and sometimes the imperfect thing is the one that lands. The law on the pillar stays. The words are unchanged, but in practice the law begins to accommodate exceptions that are individually justifiable and collectively corrosive. A judge who once resolved a case involving a noble household within a week finds reasons for delay, while the household's representatives visit him informally in the late afternoon. Canal maintenance funds that once flowed automatically to the canal wards because the canal wards needed them now require a request that requires a review, that requires a waiting period during which the canal warden is expected to explain himself to people who have never touched a pole or raked a bend. In the provinces, the island has established on nearby coasts. And this is the part where something in a modern reader wants to surface, wants to name what kind of arrangement this is becoming, and the ancient world presses back with its different moral vocabulary, and you let it pass. In those provinces, the tax collectors arrive with slightly heavier expectations than the previous year. Not heavy enough to produce immediate complaint. Heavy enough to shift the relationship from something resembling partnership towards something resembling a simpler arrangement. A prince with more orichalcum on his harness than function requires. A court hymn that praises the king's judgment where it used to praise the gods. A magistrate letting his son skip drill because the boy is tired. These accumulate silently. The way silt accumulates in a harbour channel until one morning the pilot's depth reading contradicts the chart, and he realizes the chart has been wrong for a while, and nobody measured. The fields are still green, the harbour is still full, the walls still catch the evening light in a way that makes visitors stop and look, and this is the problem. This is the thing that makes the account almost unbearable to read once you know how it ends. Because a prosperous city is a city that has the loudest possible argument against anyone suggesting it is in trouble. And the counter-argument, the one about the attention softening and the discipline becoming ceremonial, that argument has no sound. It is the absence of something. Absence does not make noise. The old account says the gods saw the divine portion in the blood of the kings thinning as the human portion grew. I take this to mean the quality of attention that had once been fixed on the common good had shifted. The virtue that had been the operating principle became the ceremonial principle, still performed on the appointed days, still spoken of with appropriate gravity, no longer woven into the small daily choices that a city's actual character is made of. The streets were bright. The shadow was already there. The courts sit in colonnaded halls, in a ring, shade. And I think the shade matters more than the account bothers to say, because argument conducted in shade is argument where the body can still think. And a body that can still think is more likely to arrive at something true than one standing in full sun with sweat in its eyes. A citizen with a grievance walks in, tells it to a clerk. The clerk records names, records the nature of it, records everything in those careful columns they put in every document this city produces. The judges are chosen by the kings. They answer to the pillar. There is a real difference between those two things, and the city feels it. A judge who answers to the pillar answers to what was written and agreed to, which is different from answering to what the man who appointed you wants from you this particular week. That distinction The whole arrangement rides on that distinction. Remove it, and what you have left is furniture, fines, public work, harder answer for the repeat, exile at the limit. And exile is feared more than pain. I want to sit with that a moment, because I think it is the most honest thing the account says about what this place meant to the people living in it. To be sent beyond the rings is to lose, not your safety, not your comfort exactly. The rhythm, the daily rhythm that makes the place a life rather than a duration. Fear of losing that rhythm is what keeps the ordinary days orderly, without anyone needing to make the coercion visible. The warehouses on the outer ring, grain, oil in sealed jars, metal ingots stacked in rows. The coins are plain, the god's face, the pillar's sign, no decoration. Value in the exchange, not the object. Evenings the city winds down the same way it woke up. Gatekeepers close the bridge gates. Watchmen light the parapet lamps. Scribes stack their tablets, cover them with linen. Children ask one more question. In the precinct, a single lamp burns before the god because the precinct does not go fully dark. I keep coming back to that lamp in my notes, and I cannot entirely explain why. It is a minor detail, probably, by any reasonable accounting, but it feels load-bearing somehow, the way certain small facts do, and I have stopped trying to talk myself out of keeping it. The air carries bathhouse smoke and salt and olive oil burning in 100 small flames. The smell of a day that went the way it was supposed to go. That is the early Atlantis. That is what the springs and the rings and the law on the pillar made possible. Then, decline arrives the way a tide turns. You can be watching and still miss the exact moment. I want to say that plainly before I start listing symptoms, because the symptoms are easy to catalogue. The mechanism is harder to hold. A generation grew up that had never been cold in winter because the provision system existed and worked. Never hungry because the granaries held. Never uncertain about expectation because the law was clear and applied evenly. They did not choose softness. They swam in the comfort their parents built and understood the comfort to be the ocean, permanent, ambient, not a constructed thing requiring daily maintenance. I want to be careful here. I do not think the account is making a point about gratitude or work ethic. The account is making a more structurally honest point. The knowledge of how hard a thing was to build does not automatically transfer to the people who inherit it. The gap between those two kinds of knowing is where most civilizations eventually find their trouble. Not because the inheritors are bad, because knowledge of difficulty is carried in the body, and bodies are not inherited. The change is atmospheric. That is the word I keep returning to. A slight loosening of attention. A small substitution of the impression of a thing for the thing itself. A tendency to want credit before the work is finished, or not even want it exactly, just to reach for it on reflex. The walls of the rings begin to be polished for a different reason. Before, maintenance was about corrosion resistance. A polished wall is a wall that will be standing next season. Now the walls are polished because the shine impresses visitors, and because a city that impresses visitors feels from the inside like a city that is doing well. That feeling has truth in it. There is also a trap in it. The trap is that you can begin maintaining the impression while the reality it was meant to reflect quietly softens beneath the surface, and the impression being more visible than the reality, is what continues to receive attention. Let me collect the thread here. We are at the point where several things start happening simultaneously, and I want to give them in the right order. The banquets run later. The old practice was to eat well after the day's work and dismiss the musicians before midnight, so the palace woke remembering it was a place of governance. Midnight becomes flexible. Musicians learn songs that praise the king's wisdom specifically, by name, which is a different kind of song from one that praises wisdom as a general virtue. The general virtue earns praise through demonstration. The named man earns his through the physical proximity of the compliment to his ear. Those two mechanisms produce different things in the man being praised over time. That is not a complicated point. It is a point about feedback, about what the praise teaches the person receiving it. The dishes at these banquets arrive from further. Fish from waters the island's own fishermen cannot reach. Birds that would take a local hunter 10 days to find. Spices pronounced badly by everyone at the table but present, because their presence announces connections that extend past the horizon. Men who inherited their positions rather than building them through the discipline of the early years begin to regard restraint as a philosophy suited to people with fewer options. A philosophy meaning something other people have. The priests notice. They speak among themselves. They do not speak loudly to the public because a priest who has been at this long enough knows that a sermon aimed at people not yet ready to receive it is experienced as noise. They wait. They keep the lamp burning. Anyway, the bull hunt. This is the detail that stays with me longest after I put the notes down. I want to say heartbreaking, and I am going to resist it. Not because the word is wrong exactly, it just implies an emotional availability the account does not have. But something about this detail. The kings still come to the precinct, still wear branch crowns, still swear over the blood. But the bull, more often now, has been kept in a field. It is a fine animal. It is not broken. It has simply encountered a boundary and learned to live inside it. And there is a difference, physical, felt, real, between the courage required to bring down something that has always been free and the competence required to manage something that has been managed before. Old men who attended the earlier ceremonies carry in their bodies the memory of genuine sweat and genuine danger and an outcome not guaranteed in advance. They notice the change the way people notice departures from things they knew firsthand, with complete certainty and almost no ability to explain it to anyone who wasn't present. A symbol that is earned sits differently in the chest from one that has been arranged. The priests can feel the difference. Something like, and I recognize this comparison is going to be imperfect, too domestic for what I am reaching toward. But it is late, and I have been at this a long time. It is something like the difference between a room where people are genuinely glad to see each other and a room where people are performing gladness. Not quite right. Close enough to keep. The law on the pillar stays. The words are unchanged. In practice, the law begins to accommodate exceptions that are individually justifiable and collectively corrosive. A judge who once resolved a case involving a noble household within a week finds reasons for delay, while the household's representatives visit informally in the late afternoon. Canal maintenance funds that once flowed automatically to the canal wards because the canal wards needed them, now require a request that requires a review, that requires a waiting period during which the canal warden is expected to explain himself to people who have never touched a pole or raked a bend. In the provinces the island has established on nearby coasts, and this is the moment where something in a modern reader almost surfaces, wants to name what kind of arrangement this is becoming, and the ancient world presses back with its different moral vocabulary, and you let it pass. In those provinces, the tax collectors arrive with slightly heavier expectations than the previous year, not heavy enough to produce immediate complaint, heavy enough to shift the relationship. A prince with more orichalcum on his harness than function requires. A court hymn praising the king's judgment where it used to praise the gods. A magistrate letting his son skip drill because the boy is tired. These accumulate silently, the way silt accumulates in a harbour channel until one morning the pilot's depth reading contradicts the chart, and he understands the chart has been wrong for a while and nobody measured. The fields are still green, the harbour is still full, the walls still catch the evening light in a way that makes visitors stop. This is the problem. A prosperous city is a city that has the loudest possible argument against anyone suggesting it is in trouble. And the counter-argument, the one about the attention softening and the discipline becoming ceremonial, that argument has no sound. It is the absence of something. Absence does not make noise. The old account says the gods saw the divine portion in the blood of the kings thinning as the human portion grew. I take this to mean the quality of attention that had once been fixed on the common good had shifted. The virtue that had been the operating principle became the ceremonial principle, still performed on the appointed days, still spoken of with appropriate gravity, no longer woven into the small daily choices that a city's actual character is made of. The streets were bright, the shadow was already there. Athens stood at its hour the way a person stands who has been afraid before and knows what fear requires of them. The assembly met at first light. The noise it made was specific. The noise of people who have come to decide something that cannot be undecided, which is a different noise from every other kind of assembly noise and recognizable to anyone who has sat in one. Men who had spent the previous week arguing about road repairs and water allocations stood in the morning air and weighed something graver. Messengers from the coastal islands reported ships with red metal on their beams, sitting outside headlands, with the patience of things that have already made their decision and are waiting for the other party to arrive at the same one. A pilot from a harbour under blockade described the tightening of the ring around his port in physical detail that left no room for interpretation. The vote came fast. Full authority to the generals. Triarchs called to bring their ships, name their crews. The poorest citizens, men who owned nothing worth fighting over except the city itself, came forward for the rowing benches. Athens had always taken a certain pride in this, the democracy of the oar. I find I want to linger here longer than the account allows me to, because there is something in that phrase, the humblest hands in the city having a place in its defense that is real rather than symbolic, that the account passes over in a single breath. Moving on. The shipwrights had kept good timber for 2 winters. Good shipwrights keep good timber the way good bakers keep good flour. On the day it is needed, it will be too late to go looking. The first operation was surgical. A harbour under blockade sat behind a bar that outsiders misread because the current at dusk ran at an angle that made the safe channel invisible to anyone who had not worked that approach from inside. The Athenian captains had worked it from inside. They put out in the dark with the tide doing most of the work and the coxswain speaking quietly to keep the stroke even without the drum that would have announced them. And I want to pause on that detail the drum left behind, because it is one of those choices that looks like a small thing and is, in fact, the whole thing. The decision that separates people who understand what they are doing from people who are performing the shape of it. When the island's guard ships moved to close the channel mouth, the Athenians split. A third of the fleet went over a shallow bar that pilots from other cities had called impassable. They had tried it once at the wrong state of tide and drawn the wrong conclusion. Local pilots don't make that mistake. The lead ship crossed with the sound of sand on her keel. The angle the bar's shape made possible turned the blockade from a wall into something else. The main force drove straight at the guard ships and made the kind of argument with their rams that had one answer. By morning, the harbour was open. Fishermen who had been in doorways came out and cut enemy moorings. Grain that had been sitting in a customs house waiting for someone to decide who owned it got decided. The victory was small on a map, large in the other way. The way victories are large when they demonstrate something previously undemonstrated, which is that a thing widely believed to be impossible is merely difficult. The distance between those two words is where most of history lives. Free towns along the coast sent envoys that same week. Some brought ships, some brought grain, some brought promises, which are worth less than ships, but more than nothing, and can be converted if the management is careful. The city sent back two things that matter more than reassurance: a specific timetable and a specific commitment to return. I need to pause here. I have been writing about the logistics of alliance formation for the better part of an hour, and something about the plainness of what I just described. Predictable allies being rarer and more useful than enthusiastic ones feels like it deserves more than I am giving it. It is the kind of observation that sounds obvious until you try to name a moment in history when a city actually did it, and then the list gets short. Continuing. The main engagement came on a flat reach of beach east of the city, where a stream came down to the sea over a bed of small stones. The island's forces landed in good order, which is to say, they landed the way people land when they have practiced landing in simulated disorder and have developed the muscle memory for creating order within it. Engineers had earthworks up before noon. Officers positioned companies with gestures that contain years of shared vocabulary. Athens met them on ground chosen with care. The center on the level, the right anchored on the stream, the left refused by a small distance. The front ranks were men whose bodies had absorbed enough impact over enough years to process fear as information rather than instruction. And I am not sure that is the right way to say it. I keep writing it and looking at it, and it is close, but the scene shows. The rows behind them were farmers and potters and smiths who had drilled until the formation was something they were rather than something they did, at least for the duration of it. The first crash belongs to the slings and archers. the exchange of projectiles that precedes the meeting of lines, noise and smoke and spent shafts on the ground. Then the formations moved and the contact happened, and what followed was decided by endurance and stubbornness, the slow push that settles disputes between forces too committed to sensible retreat. The island tried to drive a wedge through the Athenian center. The front ranks answered with the half-step back and the reset that experienced soldiers use to manage pressure, the way a good dam answers a river in flood, although I recognize the simile does something slightly wrong, and I am leaving it anyway because the hour is late. The lines bent twice, straightened twice. The stream on the right ran the color streams run in battles. The refused left held under a continuous rain of slingstones that bruised without killing, which is the particular misery of being worked over by people who know exactly what they are doing. When the island tried to reinforce from the ships, sending fresh companies down the beach to add weight to the press, the wet stones of the tidal margin betrayed their feet. The Athenians saw the stumble. What happened next is, this is one of the things I find genuinely difficult to describe, and I want to be honest, that the account does not entirely give me what I need here. So some of this is inference from parallel cases, the coordinated advance that happens when a formation has been together long enough to feel a moment collectively, without orders. 3 paces as one. The fresh companies that had expected to arrive as a hammer found a wall already moving toward them. The island forces withdrew to their earthworks. They went back in order. They left the field. Anyway, the sea fight narrows, chosen deliberately, because in open water numbers create flanks, and in a narrows numbers create confusion. The Athenian captains understood this. The key to winning an unequal engagement is finding the ground where the inequality inverts, a sentence that is easy to write and requires a particular quality of mind to actually execute under pressure, with the wind doing whatever it was doing that day. The Diakplus was executed twice. The breakthrough maneuver, the one that opens a gap in the enemy line and shears away oars, practiced until it sits in the hands rather than the head. When the island tried to answer with a wheeling turn and a hard charge, the Athenian ships turned inside the arc and cut at the exposed sterns. A ship turning hard presents its least defended aspect to anyone with the patience and position to use it. The island did not have patience left by then. By noon the water was complex with broken spars and the smell of pitch. Ships lost on both sides. What the island also lost, and this is where something in the modern reader wants to reach for a vocabulary, the ancient world is not offering a kind of strategic psychology terminology, and the account just says what it says without that apparatus, was the assumption that a superior fleet in sufficient numbers is undefeatable by a smaller force in chosen water. That assumption had been the psychological foundation of the whole campaign. Its loss changed the arithmetic of what was still possible. The island fleet withdrew to open sea. The Athenians formed their defensive line, prows out, hulls joined, waited for an assault that did not come. Power that had expected a parade had found a fight. An empire accustomed to moving on schedule had met a city that did not observe the schedule. What followed was patience. The grinding, undramatic kind that conflicts settle into when both sides have looked at each other clearly enough to understand that a quick end is not available. The island held its western bases. Grain from the river country kept moving through controlled channels. Garrisons sat in their hilltop positions and counted seasons. Officers wrote letters home using the language of duty and progress to describe what was increasingly the experience of maintenance. And I want to stay with that gap for a moment because it is doing real work in the account and gets passed over quickly. Holding what you have when holding costs more than expected is a different enterprise from taking what you want. The people doing the holding begin to understand this. The people directing them arrive at that understanding later, if at all. In Athens, the funerals went up the roads. Names were carved. Mothers stood in the particular stillness that follows the exhaustion of grief's loudest forms, left with the kind that occupies the body permanently. The city did not pretend the costs were small. Each cost became an argument for ensuring the cost bought something sufficient. This is the mechanism. Previous losses become the reason to continue rather than the reason to stop. I'm not sure I can describe it better than that, and I have tried. New hulls were laid, new crews trained. The Dirk Plus drilled until young captains could feel the right moment through the deck. The island's council rooms began to hear, beneath the language of strategy and destiny, the quieter language of arithmetic. Garrisons, cost, grain, and men. Captains needed elsewhere were holding ports that didn't want holding. Provinces meant to supply the campaign were being taxed for a campaign supposed to pay for itself. The basic economic structure of an empire that is overextended does not resolve by wishing. So there, the pillar in the precinct caught the lamplight the way metal catches lamplight, steadily, without qualification, words unchanged, but the men reading them at ceremonies stood differently from their grandfathers. Their grandfathers had read the words and felt them bite. These men felt the weight of the occasion and the formal pressure to appear to feel what the occasion required. A small distinction, the largest distinction there is. The warnings came in stages, clearly enough in retrospect, ambiguously enough in the present to be forgiven for misreading them. And I want to say that plainly before describing the sequence, because what I am about to describe has a shape in hindsight that it absolutely did not have for the people living through it. The warm spring ran hotter than it should for a week, and then went quiet. The cold spring changed flavor in a way a tongue could detect without naming. Fishermen found fish with markings that had no business being on fish in water that clean. The dolphins that had always made the ring water, their performing ground stopped coming, as if they had received information that the people on shore had not been given. In the ship sheds, caulkers swore the seams they had just laid were weeping when they returned the next morning. The first tremor was noon. Cups moved. Door frames complained. The water in bowls made the face of the sea in miniature. Children laughed. The older people smiled in a way that looked like agreement and was something else entirely. They put their hands on the nearest solid object because bodies know things before minds are willing to consider them. I find I cannot improve on that as an observation. The account gives it in a single clause and moves on. The second tremor came before dawn. Earth movement before dawn comes without context, without the reassurances of daylight. Men woke in darkness with hearts that had already been running before consciousness caught up. Dogs howled in the harbour. A stack of spars on the outer quay chose that moment to finish falling. And the sound they made on the stone was the sound of a large object deciding it was done, pretending to be stable. Old men pressed their palms flat on the earth, trying to read the pulse of the ground. They found it irregular. The swarm began that evening. Short jolts, long slow movements that made roof timbers groan. And beneath everything, this is one of the moments where the account gives me something I genuinely struggle to render, and I am going to try anyway. Beneath the sound, there was a sensation, a vibration at the edge of hearing that seemed to come from every square foot of the ground simultaneously, rather than from any direction. I need to pause here, because what follows is the part of this account I have read most often and understood least. The mechanisms I can describe, the sequence I can lay out. What I cannot fully give you is the texture of it, the experience of a city encountering something for which it had no prior category. The account has the events. I am not sure the events are the whole story. Continuing, the king sent runners to the inner bridges, lower the harbour chains, drain the ring water to safe marks so the walls wouldn't face the additional pressure of their own moats if the ground moved again. In the precinct, the priests fed the altar flame with oil until the light was high and steady, the way they fed it on great occasions. The pillar of red metal caught that light and held it. It looked the way it had always looked at ceremonies, like a promise that took its obligations seriously. Then the third shock came. It threw people from their feet on the outer ring. The bronze plates on the wall rang against their fastenings with a sound the people who heard it would spend the rest of their lives describing as the sound a shield wall makes when it breaks, a sound none of them had heard before but recognized immediately, which is the kind of detail I find. I don't know exactly what I find it. Remarkable is the wrong word. Sitting with it a moment, a seam opened in a quay. The stone dropped the width of a hand, and from the gap a thin jet of sand fountained upward, small and precise, announcing that something underneath the surface was no longer where it had been. Anyway, the hot spring roared. The cold spring spat air in bursts with no rhythm, and then the sea moved. The water in the ring basins drained as if pulled, leaving mudflats exposed, fish arguing from 4 inches of water that had been 12 feet moments before. Before anyone finished processing the sight of the exposed mud, the water came back. Higher, it climbed the inner walls with the indifference of something that has not been informed that walls are supposed to stop it, like a person walking through a room who hasn't seen the furniture yet, except that simile is doing too little work for what I'm describing. And I recognize that, and I'm leaving it anyway, because it is late and I have run out of better ones. It fell and returned higher still, testing, finding what held. Boats tore free and moved with the water, rather than on it, spinning across the ring basins, hitting the bridge piers with sounds that carried across the whole city. One of the great transport triremes broke free and moved sideways into a bridge pier that had stood since the time of Atlas. The pier made the decision that piers make when struck sideways by something very heavy. It fell. Fires found their moment. Braziers stable for years discovered an instability they hadn't previously expressed. Lamps fell. In the palace quarter, a row of roof beams collapsed and created the situation that roof beams create when they fall through floors and keep going. The account does not slow here. I want it to slow. It doesn't. The harbour chains, the ring walls, the precinct lamp still burning somewhere in all of it, I have to assume. Because the account does not say it went out, and I have learned to read that silence as a kind of answer. The city that had been a continuous thing, that had understood itself as a continuous thing, the single lamp burning through the night as proof of continuity, was encountering the moment where continuity becomes a question. The water came back a third time, higher. The ground in some of the open yards changed character. There is a technical description for what happened to it. The account does not supply it. I know it from other sources, and I find I cannot bring myself to use it here because the clinical vocabulary sits wrong against what follows. The packed soil that had been reliable under feet for generations became something between solid and water, accepting weight and returning it altered, taking a step to the ankle, then the knee. A wall that had looked solid that morning folded like it folded with a slow, graceful inevitability that made onlookers gasp with the particular gasp that belongs to watching large solid things behave like small, soft things. I have read this section of the account perhaps 20 times, and that gasp is the detail I cannot get past. The gasp means they were still capable of surprise, which means some part of them still believed the world had rules. The kings came to the precinct without robes, without crowns, barefoot on the stone, because the old accounts said the god listens with more attention to a man who comes in the condition he was born in rather than the condition his title gives him. They put their hands on the pillar. They spoke plainly, asked for time, asked for mercy. The pillar gave their words back in a dull ring. Something answered from below. The account says this. I believe it means tremor, means the ground speaking in its own register. But the account does not say tremor. It says, something answered. And it says the sound was like the planet acknowledging a question it had no interest in discussing. I have left that as the account gives it because I do not have a better frame for it, and substituting one would be dishonest. The last hours before dawn tore the island open. The outer plain dropped. The water that rushed in from the canals did not wait for assessment. The ship sheds split along lines that had been accumulating in the substrate for as long as the earth had been keeping its own counsel. In the inner ring, a seam opened in a street and pushed a ridge of pavement up to the height of a kneeling man, then subsided, as if it had made its point and was satisfied with the acknowledgement. The wave that came next was a renegotiation of where the shoreline was supposed to be. It climbed the bronze plates of the outer wall until the bronze went dark, and then it continued climbing, and then it went over the wall with the calm of something that has never recognized walls as a relevant category. Timbers were driven through masonry. A fishing boat whose captain had owned it for 30 years, knew every sound it made in every sea state, was lifted and thrown against a building facade with enough force that the stem lodged in a window opening and stayed there after the water retreated. Everyone who saw it described it afterward. The detail had the quality of an image chosen deliberately. I don't know who chose it. I keep that question. People ran to the central hill. This is what people do. They seek the highest ground and the place that has always meant safety. And when those two things are the same place, the run toward it has the quality of instinct and reason confirming each other simultaneously, which is, I want to say, is one of the more human things in the account. But that framing understates everything around it. So I will just say, they ran. The rings that had always guarded them made the running difficult. Bridges failed, some completely, into the churning basins below, some partially, in ways that made them more dangerous than their absence, because the partial bridge still invites weight. I need to pause here, because I have been describing physical events for some time, and the physical events are not the hardest part of this section to convey. The hardest part is this: a city that had organized itself around the premise of its own continuity, the lamp that never went out, the law that did not change, the springs that ran on a schedule, was discovering in the space of a few hours that continuity is a practice, and practices can be interrupted. I am not sure the account itself knows how to hold that. It moves very fast through what follows. I will try to move more carefully. The soldiers who had survived formed a cordon at the one stair that still had dry ground at its base. They moved people down it with the specific care available only to people who've set aside every concern except the one directly in front of them. They did not look up when the next shock sent dust from the stone above. Looking up was not relevant. The task was the person in front of them. And then the next person. The engineers arrived with stone dust on their faces, told the kings the truths no one wanted but everyone needed. The inner wall had broken at 3 points. The red plates hung at the break lines like scales on a wounded animal. Still beautiful, entirely unable to help. I recognize that simile is the account's, not mine, and also that it is almost right, but lands slightly short of what it is reaching for. Almost. I am leaving it because the account earned the attempt. Anyway, out on the plain, Order was discovering how quickly its materials become something else when the substrate shifts. Field terraces folded. Canals became rivers that had stopped respecting the original engineering, finding new channels wherever the ground permitted, cutting through boundaries that had been surveyed and recorded and trusted. Storehouses measured to the width of a finger came apart as the soil lost the quality that makes soil useful as foundation. In the distance, sections of hillsides separated and moved in ways hills are supposed to be exempt from, bringing groves with them, which is one of those details that sits in the body differently from the others. I cannot explain exactly why, the scale of it perhaps, the casual wrongness of it, and I have returned to it more than I expected to while writing this. The sea continued, lesser surges after the greatest. Lesser the way aftershocks are lesser, meaning damaging without being catastrophic. They found new paths through the rubble the earlier water had made. They pulled people from doorways. The last surge of the morning was long and deep and slow. It did not foam, did not crest, lifted everything still floating, and moved it with unhurried thoroughness. And when it fell back, it left what it left. A boat perched on a second-floor balcony, a trireme laid across two fallen buildings, like a bridge started in the wrong material, which is the image the account ends this section with, and which I have been thinking about since I first read it. Then quiet. Smoke rose from wet fires, salt and ash and the sweetness of crushed grain and the mineral sour of exposed canal mud. The birds were gone. The dogs stood trembling or lay down in the way animals lie down, when they have reached a decision about what has just happened. The sun came up, the central hill stood, a few elevated remnants stood. The ring city below was a diagram of what had been broken stone, changed light, channels moving by new rules. The outer plain was brown water, slow, carrying what it carried. The harbour mouth had changed. The bar that pilots had trusted for generations had shifted, opening where no channel had been, closing where the reliable one had run. The kings held the square before the broken temple. They organized. This is what the account gives them, and I think it is the right thing to give them. They sent men to the higher stones with water and blankets, boys with chalk to mark safe paths from paths that would give, old people to the counting places where names were being taken, because a voice that people trust makes the naming feel like continuation. Every hand that could carry was given something to carry. Every boat that could float became a ferry. The flat board where names were written began in order, became a scatter of nicknames and partial families. A woman gave 3 names and stopped being able to speak. A boy tied a cloth strip to his arm and asked to be counted as a bearer rather than a passenger, because he wanted to belong to the people still doing things. The account gives that boy 1 sentence. I have nothing to add to it. Engineers walked the broken bridges with poles, testing the footing before committing their weight. They marked a map on a piece of broken wall in ash. 1 path down, 1 path to the only stair that reached a jetty, 1 place where a boat could come in without destroying itself on what used to be foundations. They set crews to clear the lane. Stones moved, beams cut. Work moved because the people doing it knew how to find order in ruin when the orders are short and the task is immediate and the hands are many, and everyone understands that the time available is less than the time needed, and that this means you do not stop. Mothers handed their children to men they had never met and watched them disappear into the crowd moving toward the boats. They did this because the remaining option had ceased to be one. This is the arithmetic of catastrophe. It removes most of the calculations that normally occupy a day and leaves only the one. A team of runners came back from the lower rings. A cluster of houses had held on a rise, a small private hill, an accident of geography, and people were alive on the roof, waving cloth. A team took ropes. They returned with fewer than had been waving. By midday, the hill had become a camp. Poles and mats made lanes, fires from broken furniture. A boy who had spent his life tending goats found himself the cook, which is the kind of promotion the circumstances would have been content not to offer. A physician worked without stopping, using wine on his tools until the wine ran out, and then using hot water and intention, which is a phrase the account gives, and which I find I cannot improve on, so I am leaving it as it is and moving forward. The ground still moved. The tremors had become a restlessness, small, persistent shifts that made standing feel imprecise, that kept the question of how stable any given surface was from being answerable. The sea continued its renegotiation at intervals, with no schedule. In the late afternoon, the sea drew back further than it had drawn back since the morning's first great retreat, and showed for one long moment the bones of the rings, bridge piers, culvert mouths, canal beds lined and exposed and dry and strange. A city made visible as a skeleton is made visible, stripped of the flesh of daily life, left with only the structural decisions. I find this image, and I am aware I keep flagging the images that arrest me, that this has become a habit of these notes. I find this one the hardest to hold, because the structural decisions were good. The canal beds were well lined, the culvert mouths were well placed, the engineering was sound, and it was ending anyway. People ran out into the mud. They came back with a table, a cradle, a chest with iron bands that had held where every other binding failed. The chest opened to a book whose pages had fused in the water, a record of something that would not now be read. The last surge came while they were still in the mud. The kings understood the island would not hold another night. The earth had broken its agreement with the ground. And I recognize I am borrowing that phrase from the account rather than finding my own. But the account arrived at it first, and I cannot find an angle on it that improves the approach. The channels had become inlets. The streets were becoming part of the harbor, and the harbor was becoming part of the ocean. And this was a progression that would continue regardless of what anyone decided. They sent for every boat from every neighboring island and every small harbor within a day's reach. They ordered the guards to keep pointing people toward the water. A city that loves itself must, when the moment requires, love its people more than it loves the city. The account gives this as a plain statement of fact. I have read it perhaps a dozen times, trying to find the seam where it becomes complicated, and I keep not finding it. I need to pause here, because what follows is the end of the account as a continuous record of events, and it has taken me longer to write this section than any other. And I want to be honest that some of what I am about to give you is the account, and some is inference from the account's silences, and I cannot always tell you with confidence which is which. The last priest with the strength for climbing went to where the pillar had stood. He poured oil over the edge of the opened floor. He said the names of the people who had built the island from a hill and a spring. He asked for nothing, because there is a point past asking where what you do is a continuation of what you have always done, not for result, but because it is the only remaining way to be yourself. That is what the account says, word for word, near enough. Anyway, the sun sat low. The sea surface to the west showed the slope that precedes the thing that ends arguments. The ground under the hill vibrated below the register of sound, a frequency that bypassed hearing and arrived in the chest, in the stomach, in the back of the teeth, like standing next to something very large that is running, except that this comparison is doing approximately half the work required, and I am aware of it and leaving it anyway. Stones knocked against each other underfoot with the sound of an enormous instrument played without care. A deep breath passed through the island. The island did not breathe out. The central hill settled by the width of a hand. Then again, cracks chased each other through the pavement and found the children still on the hill, and the children screamed and ran, because the idea of the ground itself moving towards you is one the body refuses without protest, regardless of age. The account is precise about the children screaming. It is precise, and it does not linger. I am going to follow its example. Boats pushed off. The last trireme took a load that covered her deck bow to stern. The oars found water and set the stroke. A skiff capsized, and the swimmers were pulled aboard by whoever reached them. Strangers helping strangers without time for the formalities of introduction. the slope of the sea became a wall. It lifted the outer rubble and poured it over the ruins as if the island were a shallow bowl the sea had decided to fill. The last of the inner wall went in 3 stages, each quieter than the one before. The clamps popped. The red metal plates peeled from the stone behind them, still beautiful, already detached. The stone folded and fell into the opening below, without the drama that the loss of something so large would seem to demand, a silence that was worse than noise. From the decks of the boats, the people who looked back saw the hill with the temple settle into the ground the way a person sits down when they have decided they are finished standing, steadily, completely, without struggle. The roofs sank, the columns descended, the tops of the columns descended. A single block of red stone, the threshold of the temple, the doorstep over which every king had stepped on the way to make his oath, rose briefly above the surface as if trying to be seen, then gone, where the city had been, a surface of brown churned water, thick with the dismantled materials of everything built there over all those generations, moving with a heaviness that belonged to something other than water, the slow turbulence of stone and timber and soil, and the carried objects of thousands of daily lives. I have no way to end that sentence that feels proportionate to what it contains. I have tried several. Moving on. Night came without stars. Smoke and the exhalation of the sea made a ceiling. Men rode until their hands could not feel the wood, and then lay along the benches until someone else could take the stroke. Fathers counted children by touch in the dark. Mothers held their mouths to children's ears and spoke into them so the words would not be lost in the surrounding sound of the sea. The kings had given up the idea of being kings. They moved through the boats doing the work available, carrying water, steadying the injured, giving orders only when the orders were the simple kind that save a life in the next moment. At first light, the boats found the place where the island had been. This is worth following because it tells you something about why the story persists. Consider what Plato actually put into the dialogues, counting only what is measurable, a location beyond the Pillars of Hercules in the ocean, a size larger than Libya and Asia combined, which is either a measurement or a figure of speech, depending on whether you read Plato as a geographer or a philosopher. And the answer to that question has driven a remarkable quantity of human effort over the centuries. A harbour plan specific enough to sketch metals, crops, laws, a history of virtue followed by a history of its own corruption. An end. That is more detail than a moral lesson strictly requires. You can make the point about pride and consequences with far less specific architecture. You do not need to know the width of the canal or the color of the stone on the middle ring to understand that a city valuing appearance over substance will eventually answer for the substitution. Plato gave the detail anyway, and the detail is the infection. A reader who knows the width of the canal cannot easily dismiss the canal. A reader who knows the color of the stone on each ring finds it harder to place the city entirely in the allegorical. The precision creates a problem for the imagination. Precision makes things feel real, and things that feel real generate the question of whether they were, in fact, real. Once that question lodges in a reader, it does not dislodge. It sits there and waits for new evidence. And every new piece of evidence about ancient floods or sunken coastlines or collapsed Bronze Age civilizations feeds it rather than quieting it. Plato may have known exactly what he was doing. He understood rhetorical technique the way a builder understands load-bearing walls, fundamentally, with practical application in every project. He wrote Socratic dialogues, a form specifically designed to leave the reader doing the thinking rather than receiving the conclusion. An unfinished dialogue about a city that fell is consistent with a teaching philosophy that values the question over the answer, and I find I keep returning to that consistency because the alternative explanation that Plato simply ran out of time, lost his notes, forgot, sits badly against everything else we know about how deliberately the man worked. I cannot prove intent. The consistency keeps suggesting it. The story found its largest audience among ordinary people looking for a framework in which to place their sense that the past held something larger than they had been told. The 19th century was particularly susceptible to this. The Industrial Revolution had dismantled traditional structures fast enough that a whole generation grew up without the deep roots that earlier generations had grown into. And without deep roots, a person sometimes looks for old roots, for the ancestral, for the grandmother civilization that explains why things are the way they are. Donnelly's book arrived at exactly the right moment for exactly this hunger. It told readers that all civilization came from one source, and that the source was magnificent, and that its loss was a catastrophe visited from outside. This is a comfortable story if you feel the world has lost something essential and cannot name what. It relieves you of asking whether the loss was preventable, because a seismic catastrophe is not preventable, and therefore no one is to blame, and the distance between the present imperfect moment and the glorious vanished past is not anyone's fault. Plato's original story is not comfortable in this way. Plato puts the responsibility precisely and clearly on the people inside the city. The earth does not shake because the earth decided to. The earth shakes because the gods saw that the divine portion in the blood of the rulers had thinned and judged what they saw. In the ancient framework, and I want to be careful here, because a modern reader immediately wants to translate this into a different vocabulary, wants to say what we would now call systemic failure, wants to reach for the secular equivalent, and the ancient text resists that translation without refusing all traffic with it. In that framework, divine judgment and natural catastrophe are expressions of the same principle. Consequences follow choices. The earthquake is a response. I need to pause here, because what I am about to describe is the distinction the entire account has been building toward, and I want to give it the space it deserves rather than rushing it to get to the end. The difference between reading the earthquake as pure misfortune and reading it as consequence is the difference between a cautionary tale and a tragedy. A cautionary tale says, here is what happens when people make these choices. A tragedy says, here is what happens when people who are capable of knowing better, who have every advantage and every tradition and every institution built to help them avoid the mistake, make it anyway, slowly, without announcement, through accumulated small selections. Atlantis is a tragedy. The people who built the harbor knew how to build harbors. The engineers who cut the canals understood fluid mechanics. The priests who kept the ceremonies knew what the ceremonies were for. The kings who wrote the law on the pillar understood what the law required of them. none of this knowledge was lost. What was lost was the willingness to apply it to every decision rather than only the ones where the application was easy and visible and praised. Anyway, this is why the story is still being told. It is about a civilization that knew and chose differently anyway, quietly, incrementally, through 10,000 small selections, in which private advantage was placed marginally above the common interest, until the margin had become a gulf, and the gulf had become the distance between what the city claimed to be and what it actually was. Every generation that reads the account looks at it and thinks, we would not do this. We know where this leads. The detail of the architecture makes the recognition possible, and I find that this, the precision as the vehicle of recognition, the canal width as the thing that makes the moral felt rather than merely heard, is the move I find most difficult to explain to people who have not read the dialogues, because it sounds like I am claiming that specificity is a moral tool, which sounds strange, and I am, in fact, claiming exactly that, and it is strange, and it works. We can see the rings and the bridges and the walls. We can see ourselves walking in those streets. We can see reading what those choices are building toward, as if the knowledge floats above the page, like heat above stone, visible at an angle, gone when you look directly at it, which is not quite the right image, and I know it, and I am too tired to find a better one tonight. And yet, the springs are still running somewhere, one warm, one cold. The ships were built, the map grew, the harbour shone with maintained metal. The judges found reasons to delay cases involving powerful families. The crops grew, the festivals happened, the springs ran for a while. The wine was good. The singers had a new song about the sunset on the inner wall. What makes a city forget? The same thing that makes a person forget. The removal of the immediate consequences that would remind them. Prosperity insulates a city from the results of poor choices, the way comfort insulates a person from the results of poor habits. And I want to linger on that parallel longer than I am going to, because there is something in it about the relationship between the individual body and the civic body that the account gestures at without quite spelling out. And the gesture keeps snagging my attention even as I move past it. While the insulation holds, the choices feel fine. The city does not feel the friction that would signal the error. The error proceeds. The insulation thins. By the time the insulation fails, the habits that produce the error are fully formed and deeply established, and the error has become the accumulated weight of 10,000 choices, now requiring a correction so fundamental that it threatens everything the accumulated choices also built. This is the trap's geometry. You cannot remove only the bad accumulation. It is load-bearing by now. This is when pride becomes most dangerous. At the beginning, pride is still connected to something worth being proud of. At the end, and here is where I find the account most precise and most devastating, these 2 or 3 sentences that I keep returning to and keep finding more fully true than I expected. At the end, pride has become the last argument against acknowledgement of error. It stands between the city and the truth the city needs to hear to survive. And it is compelling. It is compelling because the city really did build something real. The harbour was real. The law was real. The pride has a genuine object. That is what makes it the last argument, rather than an early one. The kings at the pillar barefoot on the stone with the walls already broken and the water already moving. They had not lost their capability. They had not lost intelligence or willingness to act. What had been lost over generations was the practice of applying those capabilities honestly to the question of whether what was being done was in fact what ought to be done. The answer had been available for a long time. The springs running wrong, the dolphins gone, the judges slow. The small things spoke plainly. The city did not want to hear them. It was busy being magnificent. What the water over the place where Atlantis was, if it was anywhere, keeps is what water always keeps. Silence primarily. Silence under pressure. Silence with weight. The particular silence of water that has been somewhere a very long time and has not been asked to explain itself. The seafloor has its own geology, its own stratigraphy, its own record of what happened at the boundary between the solid and the liquid. Cores pulled from the sediment tell the story in pollen and ash and the shells of microscopic organisms. Each layer a season or a century or a millennium, each one holding the chemical evidence of the atmosphere that sat above it when it was deposited. These records have given us floods and droughts and the abrupt temperature shifts that punctuated the slow progression of climate. They have given us the ash from Thera at its correct date, thousands of miles from the eruption, preserved in layers that do not lie about sequence. They have given us the story of ice sheets and the rising seas that followed their retreat, the drowning of Doggerland under the North Sea, the flooding of the Black Sea basin, the persistent pattern of coastlines that existed when the sea was lower and are now underwater. I need to pause here because I am aware that I have just shifted registers fairly dramatically from the moral anatomy of a civilization's failure to sediment cores and submarine topography. And the shift is intentional, but I want to name it rather than pretend it is seamless. The sediment is the point. The sediment is the evidence that the sea does, in fact, swallow places where people lived. That the intuition behind the Atlantis story, whatever Plato's precise intentions, is founded on something real about the relationship between human settlement and coastal geography over long timescales. Continuing, at the edges of continental shelves, the submarine topography suggests different coastlines, outlines of land surfaces that existed during the last ice age when sea levels were substantially lower. People lived at those margins. The evidence is appearing slowly as underwater archaeology develops tools to work at depths that were not previously accessible. We are finding the remnants of camps and middens and tools in water that covered them thousands of years ago. This is not Atlantis, but all of it is the reality behind the intuition that the sea has swallowed places where people lived. The Bronze Age, and this is the section I find most genuinely fascinating of everything I have been working through in these notes. The section I would expand to 3 times its current length if the account gave me room, which it does not, so I am going to move through it faster than I want to. The Bronze Age was a time of remarkable interconnection. Tin from Britain moved to the eastern Mediterranean. Copper from Cyprus met that tin and made the bronze the age was named for. Egyptian grain-fed populations in what is now Turkey. Aegean pottery appeared in the tombs of pharaohs. The system was intricate and interdependent, and when it began to fail in the 12th century, before the Common Era. It failed from the accumulated stress of drought and migration and internal rebellion and the particular vulnerability of complex interconnected systems to cascading failure, where one broken component puts pressure on the next and the next does not hold, and what had been an architecture of mutual support becomes an architecture of mutual collapse. The palace at Mycenae burned, Tiryns burned, Pylos was abandoned, Egypt survived but contracted, the trading networks collapsed, the Bronze Age ended. The period that followed was simpler, smaller, quieter. We call it the Dark Age because the writing stopped and we cannot see it well. The word dark does the work of description and also of our own limitation. Anyway, what if this collapse, this extraordinary unwinding of a sophisticated interconnected civilization in roughly 50 years around 1200 BCE, which when you write it as a single sentence, sounds like an abstraction and is in fact the end of everything the thousands of individual cities had built over centuries? What if this arrived in memory as a story? What if the story traveled through Egypt, which survived and kept records, and through the Greek lands, which eventually recovered and wrote things down again, collecting as it traveled the physical details of harbor plans and metal walls and 10 kings, details borrowed from real cities of the Bronze Age Aegean, and arrived finally in a temple where a priest who had access to very old records told it to a Greek traveler as the story of a Western island. This is a possibility. It is the kind of imaginative reconstruction available when the evidence is incomplete, when the gaps are large enough to contain a reasonable hypothesis. We should hold it lightly, as a possible explanation rather than a discovered truth. One of several ways the story could have moved from whatever kernel of reality it contained, if it contained one, to the form it takes in Plato's pages. What we do know is that Plato was writing at a moment when the memory of the Bronze Age collapse was preserved in the traditions of the cultures that had survived it, in the oral histories that eventually became the Homeric epics, in the genealogies linking contemporary families to heroes of the distant past, in the layer of sediment. And now the sediment is a metaphor, which feels appropriate given where we have been, that underlies classical Greek culture and gives it its particular texture of glory and loss. The glory remembered, the loss also remembered, though less directly, as the feeling that something large had existed before and been interrupted, that the world the Greeks inhabited was a recovery rather than a beginning, which is, when you sit with it, the same feeling the account gives the reader about Atlantis. The feeling that something was built correctly once, that it was possible, that it failed for reasons that were visible in advance to anyone willing to look, that the looking is the thing we keep not quite managing to do. The springs are still running somewhere. I keep writing that and I keep meaning it in a way I cannot entirely make precise. It is something about the persistence of the underlying capacity, the fact that what Atlantis had at its best was a set of practices and a quality of attention that are not unique to Atlantis, that appear and reappear in history wherever people decide to apply them seriously, that the story's function is partly to remind us those practices exist and that we already know what they require. One warm, one cold, both true. He was also writing at a moment when Athens had passed its own peak and was in the process of discovering what comes after, a long century from the Persian Wars to the Peloponnesian War, had seen Athens rise to the extraordinary creative height that we still use when we measure human achievement, and then spend itself in a war with Sparta that dragged on for 27 years and ended in Athenian defeat. Plato had been born into the Athens of that war. He watched the execution of Socrates. He formed his understanding of what cities do when they forget their own best principles inside that experience, in the crucible of it, not as a spectator, but as someone who had skin in the outcome and lost. When he sat down to write a story about a city that was great and then fell, he had a model close to hand. He dressed it in distant geography and prehistoric time because the lesson is more visible at a distance, and because calling the story what it was would have been imprudent and probably insufficient. A directly autobiographical account of a city's decline produces defensiveness in the citizens of that city. A story about a vanished civilization can be read and the lesson absorbed without the defensive reflex, because a reader can agree that yes, those people made that mistake without having to agree that the same mistake is being made at home, right now, by people the reader has dinner with. This is what literature does. It puts a mirror at an angle. You see yourself without seeing yourself, and the self you see in the angled reflection is sometimes clearer than the self you would see directly, because the direct image is too familiar to observe accurately. Plato put his mirror at an angle of 9,000 years. The island is gone, or was never there, or was somewhere but not where we have looked. The people who might have lived there survived the way the people of all dissolved things survive, transformed, absorbed. A smith who learned orichalcum in a place that no longer exists brings the handling of metal to a new shore and teaches it to an apprentice who teaches it to another, and the metal changes, and the technique changes, and the name changes, and eventually nothing about the practice points back to the original teacher, except the fact that someone taught it once. A farmer who learned irrigation on a ringed island brings the principle of the channel and the earthwork and the gravity-fed flow to new soil and makes it work in conditions different from the ones where he learned it, because the principle is portable even when the specific knowledge is only partially transferable. A priest who memorized the old hymns teaches them in a new place, and they change as hymns always change when the community singing them differs from the community that composed them. But the structure survives, even as the content shifts, and the structural truth the hymn was built to carry finds its way through the translation. A king without a kingdom teaches his daughter about law. She teaches her children. They build something. I need to pause here, because this section of the argument, the survival of principle through the bodies of people who carry it, is the one I find most difficult to render without it sounding like consolation. And I do not want it to sound like consolation. It is not consolation. It is an observation about mechanism, about how ideas actually travel through time. And the mechanism is unglamorous and lossy and slow, and does not guarantee that what arrives at the other end resembles what was sent. What survives is a compressed version, a residue, a principle stripped of most of its original context. That is what survives. It is enough to rebuild from, if the people who have it are willing to apply it with the same seriousness as the people who developed it. That is a significant if. Continuing, A surface of silted shallows stretched to the horizon and toward both flanks. A mudflat where the depth was insufficient for a properly drafted vessel and too much for a footing. The sea beyond was blue. The shallow between was neither sea nor land. It was the new answer to the question of where Atlantis was. Nowhere a ship could reach, nowhere a person could stand. The boats edged around the margin of this new geography, found no passage through. All struck bottom where no chart had marked. When a captain forced a way, his oars were taken by mud that held like hands. They turned toward the nearest outer islands, made for those shores, with what they had left. The landings were quiet in the way the end of a catastrophe is always quiet, full of the things that can no longer be said, because the people who are going to say them are gone. People came off the boats and stood on solid ground and let it hold them. They drank water with both hands. They lay down on the first clear surface available and pressed their faces into it, not in grief, but in recognition, in the specific gratitude of someone who was not sure they would have ground under them again and does. The people of those places gave bread in slices thinner than they would have liked and asked no questions that would require anyone to go through their night a second time in the telling. Ships from other coasts came toward the place where the island had been and turned away. The passage that had been the most reliable sea road in the Western Ocean was a shallow of silt and broken stone, slowing the water to the color of clay, offering nothing to a pilot looking for depth. Captains marked their charts with warnings in the hand of someone who has made close personal acquaintance with the reasons for the warning. No one spoke the name the island had given the ocean. They called it the shallows, the brown water. They told younger pilots that there was a place in the Western Sea where experienced men refused good coin to take a ship. The survivors rebuilt, slowly, practically, with the materials available rather than the materials preferred. Scribes who had lost their tablets still remembered the columns and built new record systems from whatever would take a mark. Masons taught island ways of fitting stone to anyone who wanted to learn. Engineers showed how to drain a field. Smiths made the small things first because small things prove the capacity still exists, and once the capacity is proven, the larger things become possible. And I find I want to linger on that sequence longer than the account does. The small things first, the deliberate proof of capability before the ambition. Because it seems to me the account is doing something careful there about what survives catastrophe and what form it takes when it survives. And then the account moves on. So I will move on. Some carried the story. No one person had all of it. A pilot who had watched the last descent from his deck drew what he had seen on a plank with charcoal in a harbour tavern and pushed the drawing away and said that trying to hold the sea teaches you what the sea thinks of hands. A priest told a scribe in a distant city that the pillar had gone down with a sound like a bell, which is what large metal objects do when they fall in certain ways, and the scribe wrote the detail in a margin without comment, because good scribes record what is said and leave interpretation to later. A king without a kingdom told his daughter that the law is not stone, that the law is the way a people remind themselves who they are when the ground fails. She heard this and stored it, the way children store what they hear from parents speaking from the very bottom of their experience, permanently. A shrine appeared on a headland where the red metal of the inner wall sometimes showed at sunset through the shallow water. A reflection, a trick of light, something that caught the eye. People left a handful of grain there when they had grain to spare. They said it was for the memory, for their own capacity to remember what had been built and what had failed to hold. I need to pause here, because the account has now handed me its closing movement, and I am aware that I have been building toward this for a long time, and the weight of what comes next it is not that I don't know how to say it. I know how to say it. I have been sitting with it long enough. What I mean is that there is a particular quality to arriving at the place you have been walking toward for hours, and the quality is not triumph. Continuing. In Egypt, the records were kept the way they had always been kept, in columns, with dates, without the editorializing that makes other people's records difficult to use. A Greek lawgiver came to Egypt in the years after he had finished improving Athens and had time to improve himself. Solon. He was the kind of person who goes to Egypt to learn something rather than to be seen learning something. A distinction that matters in ways that are difficult to quantify, but easy to feel when you encounter the two types in the same room. He went to Sais, to the temple, and sat with a priest who received him with the hospitality of someone who has something to give and has been waiting for a visitor worth giving it to. The priest listened to Solon speak of floods and fires and the way that time destroys the records of what time has done. The priest smiled. Then he began to talk. "You Greeks," said the priest, "are always children. This is not an insult. Your cities lose their records to the floods and fires you have just described. And so each catastrophe resets your memory to zero, and you believe the catastrophe you have just survived is the worst there has ever been, because you have no record of the worst ones. We have records of the worst ones. In those records, an island beyond the straits, in the ocean where the sun goes when it leaves the sky, rich in every material abundance, fields that gave generously, mines that yielded metal holding its color in sea air, a harbor built in rings around a central hill with a temple at its heart, and 10 kings governing by a law carved on a pillar. That island sent its fleet east, took cities, reached its hand toward river mouths that did not belong to it, finally turned its attention to the shores of Greece, and met a city that refused to acknowledge the arrangement. That city, said the priest, had the same quality it has always had, a preference for its own conclusions over someone else's instructions. It stood against the Western fleet in field and harbor, freed what the fleet had taken, sent the campaign reeling back from the east. And then the earth and the sea completed the argument. In a day and a night of what the record calls misfortune. And we have spent this entire account watching that misfortune from the inside. So the Egyptian priest's tidy phrase lands with a particular flatness against everything we have just been through. The island went under, where the sea road had been, a shallow of mud. The Western power and its empire and its orichalcum and its pillar of laws were gone in a single night. Anyway, Solon wrote down the numbers and the names and the details about the rings and the bridges and the metal on the walls. He planned to make a poem of it. He did not finish the poem, which is, I find I want to be irritated about this on behalf of the story. This near miss with the form that might have carried it most cleanly. And then I remember that Solon had a city to run and a legal code to build, and that most people who intend to finish the poem do not finish the poem, and the story survived anyway, which is its own kind of argument. He told it to a relative, that relative to another, that one to a younger man who would sit one day in the company of Socrates. Plato. Plato took the story and did with it what Plato did with everything he touched, which is to turn it into a question about how human beings choose to live and what happens to them when they choose badly. 2 dialogues. The first, Timaeus, named for a philosopher from the western coast of Italy, if you are keeping track, which I mention only because the detail has the slightly comic quality of a great story arriving through a chain of people, none of whom quite expected to be passing it along, sets the scene. Socrates asking his companions for a tale that would show the virtues of a well-ordered state in action. The second, Critias, after the man who had heard it in his family, begins to deliver what Socrates asked for. The city of Atlantis, as Plato describes it, is the city we have been living in for this entire account. The rings, the bridges, the metal on the walls, the 2 springs, the bull hunt, the pillar, the 10 kings at the grove, the divine portion in the blood of the rulers thinning while the human portion swelled, the decision to reach east. Plato's Critias breaks off in the middle of a sentence. The dialogue stops on its own hinge, a door left open. Whether this was deliberate, a rhetorical choice about lessons that do not resolve neatly, or accidental, a manuscript lost, a conversation never completed, we do not know and cannot know. What we know is that the story, as it has come down to us, ends without a conclusion, which means the conclusion is left to the reader. What kind of city do you want to live in? What ruin do you fear most? The story did not sink with the island it describes. It changed form. The way water changes form without becoming something that is no longer water. It became a caution in a pilot's voice, a handful of grain on a headland shrine, a detail in a margin of a scribe's other work. It became the poems Solon never finished, and the dialogues Plato did, the ones that have sat in libraries for 2,000 years, without needing anyone's permission to stay. In the Middle Ages, mapmakers filling the Atlantic with islands that might be there drew some from hope and some from the lingering memory of an island that was supposed to have been there and wasn't anymore. Antillia, High Brazil, the island of 7 cities. These were their own inventions mostly, but they drew from the same instinct, the feeling that beyond the known edge of the map, there might be something worth finding, something that the map had simply not yet caught up to. The Renaissance turned the story into an aspiration. Francis Bacon placed a new Atlantis in the West, a society whose highest virtue was the pursuit of knowledge rather than the display of wealth. He did not claim to have found the old island. He used the name to mark a place where reason might have room to operate without the interference of superstition, a pointed address to his own century without needing to name the city he was pointing at. I find Bacon's move genuinely elegant, and I am aware I am lingering on it longer than the account requires. But there is something in the choice to take a story about a civilization that lost its way and use it to describe the civilization you want to build that seems worth sitting with. Moving on. The 19th century gave the story a different kind of life. A Minnesota politician named Ignatius Donnelly published a book arguing that Atlantis had been the mother of all civilization, that the pyramids of Egypt and the step temples of the Americas were echoes of a single original, that every flood myth in every culture was remembering a single event. The book was confident. It was widely read. It was wrong about nearly everything it claimed. It survived being wrong because it offered something accurate information cannot always offer, which is the satisfying feeling of a pattern where otherwise there is only complexity. Donnelly's readers wanted the world to have a hidden center. He gave them one. The supply met the demand, and the demand did not ask too many questions about the supply. While the dreamers were writing, the scientists were sounding the seafloor. Marie Tharp drew the map of the Atlantic bottom and found a spine of volcanic mountain running down its length, evidence of tectonic activity that built and rebuilt the ocean floor on geological timescales. The floor of the Atlantic in the region where Atlantis was supposed to have been showed no evidence of a sunken continent because it is geologically young, built from material extruded by that mid-ocean ridge, not the remnant of a land surface that might have supported cities. A continent does not. This is the part where I want to render the geology in vivid terms and keep running up against the fact that the geology is its own argument and does not need decoration. The ocean told its own story about its own floor, and the story did not include marble courts. Closer to the shores Plato actually knew, archaeology found things. On the island we call Santorini, a Bronze Age city emerged from beneath volcanic ash. Streets, rooms sealed by the eruption that consumed them, jars left where hands had placed them, paintings on the walls, ships, lilies, young men with fish. The island, then called Thera, had been destroyed by an eruption of the kind that reshapes coastlines and alters climates in the middle of the second millennium before the Common Era. The damage reached Crete, where the Minoan civilization was already under pressure from other directions, where there had been a prosperous island culture centered on ships and the sea and the bull. There was afterward the memory of catastrophe, preserved in ash. The geographic problem is that Thera is in the Aegean and Plato placed Atlantis beyond the straits, outside the inner sea entirely, but a catastrophe felt across the eastern Mediterranean might have traveled in memory and mistranslation for centuries before arriving, changed in scale and placement, in an Egyptian temple record, and then in a Greek traveler's note, and then in a philosopher's dialogue. Memory moves, memory shifts. Memory does to events what the sea does to the bones of the rings. It exposes some things and buries others, and does not ask permission. I need to pause here, because there is something I find genuinely difficult about this section of the argument, the part where we are trying to locate the story in history. And the difficulty is this: every candidate site is close enough to be interesting and far enough to be inconclusive, and after a certain number of almost matches, you begin to suspect that the almost is the point, that Plato built the address to be unverifiable by design, and I cannot decide if I believe that or if it is just a comfortable conclusion to reach when the evidence gets complicated. Continuing, in Greece itself, there is a smaller echo. In the years when Plato was a young man, the city of Helic, on the shore of the Gulf of Corinth, sank into the sea after a night of earthquake and inundation. Writers recorded it. Fishermen reported seeing temple columns through the clear water when the sea was still. In our time, archaeologists found the city under coastal silt and mapped its streets. A Greek hearing Plato's account of a city swallowed by the sea did not need to reach for the remote or the mythical. He could reach for last generation. None of these candidates gives us the full address. None gives us a street we can walk. What they give is a geography of memory, a map of the kinds of things that happen and are remembered and grow in the telling, of the way that a real event, once separated from its witnesses, begins to accept additions the way a harbour silts, gradually, until one morning the depth chart is wrong. No archaeologist has excavated a site that can be called Atlantis without significant strain. The Atlantic offers no sunken continent because the physics of oceanic geology does not accommodate sunken continents of that age. The sea tells this story through basalt and magnetism and the clock that ticks inside cooling lava. And the clock does not match the story. The island, if it lived at all in the form Plato described, was a story about measure and pride that borrowed its physical detail from ships and quarries and the way men love to set laws on stone. Anyway, and yet the old lines move in the mind, the way the sound of water moves in a room after the water has stopped, which is not quite the right comparison. I'm aware of that. It is reaching for something about resonance and landing somewhere slightly adjacent to it. But I have been writing this for a long time, and it is the closest I have. A ringed harbour, a pillar holding the law, 10 kings meeting at a grove to remember they were brothers before they were rulers. A city that stood for itself against a power that had grown larger than the idea that made it. A night when the earth decided it was finished with a particular argument. These are hard to forget because they are not about Atlantis. They are about every city built by people who believed in the possibility of doing something correctly. They are about what happens when doing correctly becomes being seen to do correctly, when substance trades places with appearance and the appearance continues wearing the substance's clothes. Plato understood that a city can read itself in a story about a different city, the way a person reads themselves in a novel set in a time and place entirely unlike their own. He gave the city that failed a harbour so detailed you can walk it in the imagination, so that when it fails, the failure lands in the body. He left the story unfinished because the argument it contains is unfinished. What a city owes its people. What a people owe their city. What wealth does to the institutions built to distribute it fairly. What power does to the restraint that was supposed to govern it. That argument was unresolved in Plato's Athens and unresolved in the Atlantis of the account. Here's something in a contemporary reader wants to name the places where that argument is currently unresolved, wants to draw the line from the pillar to the present, and then stops, because Plato's method was always to let the reader draw the line themselves, and the method was not coyness, it was precision, and following it is the more honest choice. The flood went out, the story stayed, it washed into new languages and found new shapes. Sailors marked their charts with warnings and left the name off. Greece kept the memory of a pillar that rang like a bell when it fell. Merchants drew circles on harbour tables and argued about whether a city built that close to the sea could ever be permanent. What remains, stripped of all the speculation and the continent shopping and the wishful archaeology, is simple. Pride has a tide. Order fails when the people maintaining it stop asking why it exists. The sea does not bargain with the things built on its margin. A people worth the name carries its best ideas in its hands when the ground breaks, sets those ideas down somewhere new, begins again with the same attention and the same willingness to be wrong about individual decisions while being right about the underlying principle. That is what the island that may never have stood above the western water leaves us. We are the audience the dialogue was written for. We are the Greek Solon came home to. We are the people who must decide what kind of city to build on whatever ground is currently available. The island is gone. The question is still here. Sleep well. Hold what matters in your hands. The springs are still running somewhere. Both of them. One warm, one cold. Both of them true. There is a particular quality to a story that will not stay where you put it. Most stories stay. You finish reading, you set the book down, and the book is where you left it in the morning. The story has edges, and the edges hold. Atlantis is not this kind of story. Atlantis has the quality of something left in water. It spreads, seeps into the material around it, appears in unexpected places in unexpected forms, and when you try to locate the boundary between the original thing and what it has become, you discover the boundary moved while you were looking at it. This is the actual continuity. The rings and the metal and the harbor depth are all specific to a specific place and time and do not transfer. The continuity is in the principle, the idea that a community governed by rules applying equally to everyone, including the governors, is stronger than any alternative arrangement, not because the idea is idealistic, but because the evidence of long experience shows that it is true. Communities that abandon this principle fail slowly and then quickly, in the pattern the island's own story demonstrates. Slowly in the generation of small compromises, quickly in the night when the ground decides it is finished, waiting for the compromises to correct themselves. The survivors carry this knowledge, earned at the highest possible price, which is the loss of everything the knowledge was supposed to protect. They carry it to new shores. They build with the habits they brought. Some of what they build lasts. Some fails for the same reasons the first thing failed. The lesson is available on every page of history if history is read as a record of what works and what does not, rather than as a story about great individuals and their great decisions. The great decisions are usually the last ones. The important ones are the ordinary ones, made in the ordinary intervals between crises, when no one is watching and the marble is still intact and the springs are still running clear, and the choice between the easy thing and the right thing is not yet urgent. Nobody writes about those moments. Nobody reads about them. They are not dramatic, and they do not have the quality of the decision that saves the city at the last possible instant, which is the decision that gets carved and remembered and recited at ceremonies. The ordinary interval is where the city is actually made or unmade. I have said this before in different words at different points in these notes, and I keep returning to it because it keeps feeling like the thing the account most wants to say, and the thing most vulnerable to being passed over, the thing that sounds obvious when stated and is apparently very difficult to act on, given the frequency with which we observe the failure to act on it throughout the record. Anyway, the island is a clock without hands, and I recognize immediately that this comparison is slightly wrong. Not wrong enough to discard, but wrong enough to notice. A clock without hands still has a face, still implies a mechanism. And what I mean is something more like the island marks an hour without displaying it, forces you to deduce the time from the behavior of the springs and the absence of the dolphins, and the small adjustments the judges are making in the late afternoon. The island marks the hour of the ordinary interval, the hour before the springs change character, the hour when the thing that needs doing is not urgent yet and can be done without drama if it is done now, but will require drama if it is left for later, and will be unavailable for any price if it is left for much later than that. What time is that clock showing you? That is the question the story leaves in Plato's original version before the manuscript runs out of lines. That is the question the priest in the Egyptian temple was asking Solon in a language so old and careful it had been asking the question for 3,000 years before Solon arrived to hear it. That is the question the island asks from underneath the brown water, from wherever it is that stories live when the places they are about are gone. What is your ordinary interval? What are your small compromises? Where is your pillar? Can you still read it? Good night. The harbour is quiet in the rings of your imagining. The warm spring is warm. The cold spring is cold. The lamp in the precinct is steady and small in the dark. Sleep well. Carry what you carry. The strongest walls are the ones that hold.